In 1997, manga artist Tsutomu Nihoi began work on a manga series called Blame. This manga follows the protagonist Killy on his journey through the ever-expanding city to find the so-called net terminal gene. The task of finding the net terminal gene is quite existential, as this gene will help to regain control over the destructive growth of the city, which is not just a city, but a huge pile of buildings, endless blocks of concrete divided into levels. When I started reading the first volume a couple of years ago, I was surprised to find myself a little unnerved. The first thing that struck me was how silent this manga is. We spent 10 volumes with a protagonist who hardly says anything. Of course, art history is full of stoic, reserved, uncommunicative characters. But there is something special about Killy. Is there anything human about him? Does he have a consciousness? Is he just programmed to get the job done? Another thing is, this manga feels very lonely. The universe-sized city that keeps growing uncontrollably is mostly empty, and most of the creatures, humans and post-humans that Killy meets, aren't that friendly either. And the third thing that adds another layer of eeriness to the manga is its temporal, or rather spatio-temporal ambiguity. Now, I don't know about the others, but this third aspect is the one that has gripped me the most. Blame is an example of radical uncertainty, and this is what makes going through the volumes of this manga a fascinating but also a rather confusing experience. Even in the preface to the manga, Nihoi posits an ambiguous time and place. Maybe on Earth, maybe in the future. Is it a virtual reality? Is it another dimension? Is it a distant future, or perhaps an archaic, long-forgotten past that we are forever circling back to? This manga doesn't give us a clear answer. In his 2016 interview, Tsutomu Nihoi mentioned that he usually starts by thinking about the environment, and the characters come later. Having worked in construction, Tsutomu Nihoi managed to create an unforgettable topography, where ruined palaces coexist with newly built high-tech structures. The distorted relationship between time and space, between topography and chronology, when characters jump thousands of years in time or enter a medieval-looking environment, all create this mysterious, eerie, almost haunted sensation, which, at least for me, was unexpected in a work of the cyberpunk genre. Revisiting this work more than 20 years after its publication also contributes to this sense of distorted temporality. The vision of the high-tech world Nihoi proposed in the late 90s seems both archaic and futuristic, fantastic and plausible. The themes that Blame touches upon, such as transhumanism, technological singularity, and the threat of uncontrolled high-intelligence systems, are relevant today. The imagined future of the 90s somehow gives a sense of déjà vu. Have I read this before? Saw it in a dream? Past visions of the future haunt our present. The sense of linear time disappears. Hauntology is a term first introduced by Jacques Derrida in his Specters of Marx. The term itself combines the words ontology and haunting, and initially referred to persistent ideologies that return from the past like ghosts. In a way, this concept enters into a polemic with Francis Fukuyama's End of History, or the idea that there is a linear ideological progression that ends with liberal democracy. To which Derrida says, well, no, let's not be so hasty in saying goodbye to the past, because it will always find its way back. If Derrida's deconstruction of time was aimed more at ideological struggles, Mark Fisher would later use the term to describe certain aesthetic tendencies, especially in music and science fiction, where it seems that nothing new can be produced because of constant references to past ideas. This is how Fisher's idea of the slow cancellation of the future was born, the idea that contemporary postmodern culture has lost its ability to creatively imagine the future. In 2020, Merlin Coverley published his book Hauntology, Ghosts of Futures Past. In this book, Coverley traces hauntology back to the mid-19th century, although the term was first introduced in the late 20th century by Jacques Derrida. and the decision to look for the origins of hauntology in the dusty lanes and alleys of the Victorian era seems justifiable and reasonable. The Victorian era was rich in ghost stories and various thinkers with rather esoteric ideas. Most importantly, it was the time when technology such as photography became available. Ghosts have to be captured, and what better way to capture them than with a camera or an audio tape? Coverley points out that technology is a vehicle for the capture of ghosts, so it's not paradoxical that hauntology is relevant at the time of technological development. Access to recording and playback opens a window for hauntological activity. Humans have always been obsessed with archiving and documenting their experiences through technology. But now, in the age of smartphones and cameras, the past is not only remembered, it is constantly replayed. What is television but a parade of future ghosts? What is this video but a recording of a future ghost's walk? In Hauntology, Coverley excavates a few long-forgotten British thinkers of the late 19th and early 20th century. One of them is John William Donne, an aeronautical engineer and philosopher, author of An Experiment with Time. According to Donne, there isn't just one timeline, but an endless sequence of parallel timelines. We can access a higher dimension of time, for example, while dreaming, since Donne's theory was that dreams are made up of images of past experiences and images of future experiences mixed together. Déjà vu, or the feeling of having seen something before, is also embedded in this theory. Déjà vu being seen simply as cases where this breach in time is visible for a short period. This theory is rather esoteric and is based solely on the experiences reported by the author. But this principle of uncovering layers and layers of time is relevant to hauntology, because hauntology is, in a way, the manifestation of cultural déjà vu, the eternal repetition of identical moments that, by repeating themselves, cease to be identical, like the Droste effect. This effect was named after the design of the Droste cacao. This effect was named after the design of the Droste. This effect was named after the design of the Droste cacao tin, which used an image that eternally reappears within itself. This process is also called recursion, when something is defined in terms of itself, but by referring to itself it transforms. In his 2019 book, Recursivity and Contingency, Yuk Hui defines recursion as an incessant self-referential movement that integrates contingency into its own functioning, in order to realize its ultimate goal. Recursion seems to be relevant to many fields, such as computer science, linguistics, philosophy, art, and so on. As Michael Carbalis points out in his The Recursive Mind, recursion allows us to mentally travel through time, to project ourselves into the future and the past. If we approach hauntology from the perspective of recursion, it seems that the spatio-temporal ambiguity of our current cultural moment is not so paradoxical. It is par for the course. As Simon Reynolds points out in his Retromania, we are currently witnessing a deceleration of culture compared to the acceleration of technology. Technological development coincides with cultural stagnation, because technology itself allows us to constantly repeat ourselves, to relentlessly engage with the ghosts of the past. It feels like I've seen this before, but where? When we talk about ghosts, we usually assume that they inhabit a place, be it a house or a castle. The idea that a place can be a spiritual conductor, a place where portals open, is a popular parapsychic trope. There are numerous books, TV shows, urban legends about haunted places, residual haunting. Every city has its own abandoned hospital, school, church, where a friend of a second cousin swore to see or hear or feel a ghost. Some places are just haunted. What can you do about it? But let's not get too occult with it. What if we replaced ghosts with memories? Much of philosophical thought on memory from the 20th century to the present day involves some form of mourning for the loss of meaning in the places of memory. From Martin Heidegger's romanticization of rural and provincial life to Pierre Nora's places of memory, we see traces of nostalgia for the past, when places had a stable meaning in contrast to the anonymous, hostile urban environment with its inhumane fluorescent lighting and faceless architecture. In 1992, Marc Auger coined the term non-place to denote spaces lacking identity, often transitional, such as airports, hotels, supermarket chains, and coffee shops like Starbucks. There are also what we now call liminal spaces. These are places where time compresses, which might evoke this sense of déjà vu. Since all airports are sort of the same, if you've been to one, you've been to all. On the contrary, place has a certain meaning, formed over a long period of time. It has uniqueness, we can build relationships to a place. Let's take a house, a canonical representation of a place. In his Poetics of Space, Gaston Bachelard sees the house as an infinite source of imagination and mental time travel. Today, Bachelard's Phenomenology of Space reads as strangely life-affirming, because he's more concerned with comforting spaces, or what he calls felicious spaces. The house that Bachelard describes is not the house of past trauma. It's not the house haunted by malevolent ghosts. But even in this house, we still see the traces of hauntology and disrupted temporality. Bachelard, as a phenomenologist, saw time as affected by lived experience. Any corner of the house can cause a rupture in time. A little nook in which you have finished your favorite book opens the door to the past, and an empty corner that you plan to decorate with something opens a window to the future. In this sense, a house or any environment can be read as a psychic state. Anonymous, hostile, and anxiety-inducing urban spaces can also provoke the spatio-temporal dyschronia, but in a more uncanny way. In The Memory of Place, a phenomenology of the uncanny, Dylan Trigg introduces the concept of unplace in order to question the dichotomy of place and non-place. Referring to Sigmund Freud's famous essay Uncanny or Unheimlich, Trigg also uses the prefix un, implying that unplace does not signal negation but total inclusion. When Freud talks about the uncanny, or that feeling of helplessness and eeriness that comes from, for example, finding oneself several times in the same alleyway, or stumbling over the same furniture in an unfamiliar dark room, or being haunted by certain numbers, it means that one is not confronted with something completely unknown, but with something slightly familiar. Once again, we are faced with an eerie effect of recursion. Trigg describes unplace in a similar way. Unplace is an overlapping of the non-places we've already encountered before, to the point where they become familiar, making unplace something between non-place and place. As an example of such an encounter, Trigg recounts his visit to an empty service station, the standardized environment of which was both familiar and alien. His own memories and recollections of similar service stations are juxtaposed with the indifference of this particular one, creating a sense of broken continuity. Even when we encounter places to which we don't feel deeply attached, we're still dragging a trail of the past with us. Recently, I was blessed by YouTube algorithms and stumbled upon this video. A person is dancing to a song by Crystal Castles. The video looks like it was shot in the late 2000s. The dancer has a haircut that all my crushes had in 2009. Everything from the editing to the length of the video speaks to it being from the past, and at first I thought it was a repost of an old YouTube video. Only later did I realize that this channel is relatively new and that this creator is deliberately using aesthetic references to the past. The comment sections of these videos are full of people wishing YouTube would bring back videos like this, which I totally agree with, having seen several videos on loop. It seems that this person has mysteriously time-traveled from the recent past. These videos are a temporal trap that really makes you wonder what year it is right now. The ethereal sound of Crystal Castles, the group this creator usually dances to, is also haunted. Crystal Castles is a group from Toronto whose popularity peaked between late 2000s and early 2010s. Their music is partly futuristic, partly nostalgic, using the sound of old video consoles, 80s synth, and their second album was produced in various abandoned buildings, making their music in itself a showcase of hauntology. In this sense, these dance videos are a hauntological recursion, a reference to the internet culture that wasn't so long ago but is already lost. The reference within the reference within the reference. Ghosts can live on computer servers too. It might appear that hauntology is simply a fancy word for nostalgia, but as Merlin Coverley points out, nostalgia has become so omnipresent in postmodern culture that it seems redundant to refer to it at all. Hauntology is post-nostalgic. It enters the scene when, quote, the present can no longer be experienced as anything other than the sum of its pasts. In this video, I was trying to capture a certain sense, a sense of atemporality that haunts me personally during conversations about art, in an empty Starbucks before it closes, or when I ask myself why I want to visit yet another abandoned building. You could say I'm haunted by hauntology. With the term itself, some things get lost in translation. As Merlin Coverley points out, the French word for haunt is hantise, which means an obsession, a fixed idea. In a way, the preoccupation with hauntology is also hauntological. We enter another level. The dyschronia of time and space persists.